year was 1876, and the air in the small, isolated settlement of Black Creek, West Virginia, clung thick and damp, smelling of pine needles, wet earth, and something vaguely metallic. The towering, shadowed peaks of the Appalachian Mountains pressed in on all sides, turning the valley into a perpetual twilight. Elias Vance, a meticulous but slightly cynical journalist from the burgeoning city of Charleston, stepped off the dilapidated coach. He adjusted the brim of his fedora, a useless gesture against the oppressive humidity. He was here on a fool's errand, one he'd secretly relished, investigating the disappearance of Lila Mae Higgins, a young woman who had vanished 3 weeks prior. The county sheriff, a man more concerned with bootlegging than missing persons, had dismissed it as an elopement. Elias knew better. The letter he'd received, a barely legible scrawl from a frightened relative, spoke of an old way, of the community's secret. The town was a cluster of gray, unpainted shacks huddled near a grimy sawmill. Silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic groan of the mill's machinery. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of observation. Every curtain twitched, every gaze was fixed. Elias approached a general store, its porch rotting, the single lantern inside casting a sickly yellow light. Inside, the storekeeper, a man with eyes like chipped slate and a jaw tight with mistrust, barely looked up. "Looking for a room," Elias said, his voice clipped and professional, trying to project an authority he didn't feel. "No rooms here, city man," the storekeeper grunted, polishing a glass jar. "Black Creek ain't got no use for strangers." Elias slid a silver dollar across the counter, a staggering sum for a night's lodging. The storekeeper's hand moved with surprising speed, snatching the coin. "Mrs. Dobbs, a ways up the road. She rents out the shed sometimes. Don't go bothering folks, though. We like our quiet." As Elias walked the muddy road toward Mrs. Dobbs' place, the isolation began to truly settle in. The mountains felt less like scenery and more like a cage. He passed a few locals, men with rough hands and women with worn faces, none meeting his eyes, all hurrying their pace. He found Mrs. Dobbs, a stooped woman with a nervous tic, rocking on her porch. She smelled of wood smoke and lye. The shed was a drafty lean-to, but it was shelter. About the girl, Elias began after paying her another dollar. "Lila Mae Higgins. I'm here to write her story." Mrs. Dobbs stopped rocking. Her eyes darted to the dark woods behind her house, then back to Elias. "No story to tell, sir. Lila, she was a restless soul. Went to find the city lights. Happens all the time." Her voice was monotone, rehearsed. "Her cousin says otherwise, says she was happy here, says she was preparing for her wedding." Elias countered gently, watching for any flicker of emotion. A deep tremor of fear ran through the old woman's face, quickly masked by a forced calm. "The wedding was cancelled. The groom," he backed out, "said she wasn't right for him." "Who was the groom?" "Jacob Thorne," she whispered, the name catching in her throat like bone. "He lives near the old mine entrance, but don't you go bothering Jacob, he's sensitive." Elias realized he was probing too aggressively. He switched tactics. "Is there any place a man can get a proper drink in this town?" Mrs. Dobbs pointed a gnarled finger toward the town center. "The clearing. But you watch your mouth, mister. Folks here are particular about what they hear." He walked back toward the only source of light and sound he'd seen. The clearing, a dilapidated tavern. The air inside was thick with pipe smoke and stale beer. The patrons, all male and dressed in rough-spun wool, ceased their low chatter the moment he entered. The silence was deafening, the hostility palpable. He ordered a rye whiskey from the barkeep, a massive man with a permanently scowling face. Taking a measured sip, Elias addressed the room, his voice calm, clear, and projected. "Evening, gentlemen. My name is Elias Vance. I'm looking for Lila Mae Higgins. Any of you know where a girl like that might run off to?" A man at a corner table, his face scarred and his gaze steady, spoke for the first time. Run off to? He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. She didn't run to nothing, journalist. She ran from something. Something she didn't want to face. And what was that? Elias pressed. The man took a long draw from his pipe, smoke obscuring his face like a veil. The life, Mr. Vance. The life we live here. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The man's words were a thinly veiled threat, a warning that the truth he sought was buried not under the earth, but deep within the corrosive culture of Black Creek. He wasn't dealing with a simple runaway. He was dealing with a community defending a terrifying secret. This was not an elopement. This was an organized silence. As the door swung shut behind Elias an hour later, the cold air hitting his face was a relief. He had one name, Jacob Thorne, and one terrifying suspicion. The whole town was complicit. He looked up at the moon, which was barely visible through the thick clouds, its light too weak to break the darkness of the valley. He knew he was trapped here until he found the truth. The disappearance of Lila Mae Higgins is just the beginning. The Appalachian ritual is real, and the people of Black Creek will do anything to keep it secret. Don't miss the next chapter to uncover the truth. And while you're waiting, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of this terrifying story. Elias woke to the persistent clatter of rain against the thin wooden walls of the shed. It was a cold, miserable sound that matched the growing dread in his gut. The silence of Black Creek had been replaced by the sound of water drumming the earth, washing away the superficial dirt, but not the deep-seated rot. His first objective was Jacob Thorne, the jilted groom. Elias found the old mine entrance marked on a crude map he'd purchased, a muddy track winding steeply away from the main settlement. The path was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and moss, suggesting little traffic. After an arduous hour's climb, Elias reached a small ramshackle cabin perched near the dark, gaping maw of an abandoned coal mine. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a sign of recent occupancy. He knocked on the rough-hewn door. The silence that followed was agonizing. He knocked again, harder. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing Jacob Thorne. Jacob was younger than Elias expected, perhaps 25, but his face was prematurely aged, etched with a profound, almost hysterical tension. His eyes, though clear, darted restlessly, never quite settling on Elias. He looked less like a man grieving a lost fiancé, and more like a man guarding a deadly secret. "Mr. Thorne, my name is Elias Vance. I'm a journalist. I'm here about Lila Mae Higgins." Jacob didn't invite him in. He stood rooted in the doorway, blocking entry, his hands gripping the wood until his knuckles were white. "She's gone, done with. Nothing for a city man to poke at." His voice was a flat, toneless murmur. "Mrs. Dobbs said you called off the wedding, that you decided she wasn't right for you. Why?" Elias pressed, his tone deliberately calm and empathetic. Jacob's breathing hitched. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, mixing with the rain. It was my choice. She was a fine girl, Mr. Vance. Too fine for this place, maybe. Did she leave you a note? Did she say where she was going? No note, just gone. One morning the bed was empty. The ring was on the dresser. Jacob finally looked at Elias, a flicker of genuine terror in his eyes. "But she didn't leave the valley, Mr. Vance. Lila would never leave the valley." This contradicted the town's narrative entirely. Elias seized on the inconsistency. "Then where is she, Jacob?" "The whole town says she ran off. You say she's still here. Which is it?" Jacob's composure snapped. He looked wildly at the woods, then at the black mouth of the mine behind his cabin. "They don't know," he hissed, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "They think she's a flighty thing, but I know. I saw what they were doing." "What were they doing, Jacob?" Elias leaned in, his own heart starting to pound. The rain seemed to intensify, drumming out all other sounds. The preparation. It was all wrong. They were preparing her for the ceremony, the way it has to be. But she wasn't ready. And they knew she wasn't ready. But they pushed anyway. And then she fought. She fought hard. Jacob trailed off, tears welling in his strained eyes. What ceremony? What preparation? Is this some kind of local custom? A ritual? Elias asked, trying to keep the terror out of his voice, focusing only on the facts. Jacob nodded feverishly. The autumn tithing. It's done when the harvest fails, or the winter promises hardship. An old custom. To ensure the survival of the community. They choose one to be dedicated. The word dedicated chilled Elias to the bone. It didn't sound like a religious term. It sounded like a designation for sacrifice. Lila was the one chosen. No, she refused the choice. That's why the wedding was called off. I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't be the one to give her over. Jacob stepped back, his face contorted in a mix of guilt and fear. Where is she now, Jacob? If she fought and she didn't leave, where did they put her? Jacob stumbled backward, shaking his head violently. I didn't see. I only heard the screams. From the north path near the old quarry pit, I heard her calling my name. I ran, Mr. Vance, I ran, and when I came back, the whole town was quiet again. Too quiet. Who organizes this tithing, Jacob? Who makes the choice? Jacob pressed his back against the closed door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The deacons. They meet at the clearing. The old men. They decide. Now get out. They'll know you talk to me. They're always watching. He slammed the door shut, leaving Elias alone in the pounding rain. Elias stood there, soaked to the bone, the journalist's detached curiosity replaced by a visceral need to expose the monstrous truth. The town wasn't hiding a runaway, they were hiding a forced ritual, possibly a murder. The deacons, the town elders, were the key. He had a location, the north path, near the quarry pit. He turned and plunged back down the slippery track. The image of Jacob's frantic, guilt-ridden face burned into his mind. He wasn't just chasing a story anymore. He was racing against a collective madness ingrained in the mountain soil. The rain had faded to a persistent drizzle by the time Elias reached the center of Black Creek. He went directly to the Clearing Tavern, the only place where information or hostility was openly exchanged. He didn't sit down. He stood by the bar, dripping water onto the floorboards, and fixed his gaze on the barkeep. I need to speak to the town deacons, Elias stated, his voice ringing with forced authority. It's about the matter of Lila Mae Higgins. The massive barkeep didn't even flinch. The deacons don't meet with strangers, journalist. They got their own ways, their own time. Tell them I have information concerning the disruption of the autumn tithing, Elias countered, using Jacob's words like a weapon. Tell them it involves Jacob Thorne's testimony. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The barkeep's hand froze mid-wipe. A low, menacing murmur swept through the dozen or so men scattered across the room. The silence was now predatory. The barkeep lowered his voice, heavy with warning. You have crossed a line, city man. They meet at the meeting house at sunset. You be there, and you be respectful. Elias spent the remaining hours waiting in the uncomfortable confines of Mrs. Dobbs's shed, preparing. He knew he was walking into a nest of vipers. He documented his notes feverishly, detailing Jacob's testimony, Lila's refusal, and the existence of the autumn tithing. If anything happened to him, the evidence had to survive. He concealed a small, heavily inked notebook in the lining of his overcoat. As the sun dipped below the Appalachian ridge, casting long, menacing shadows, Elias walked toward the meeting house. It wasn't a church, but a simple, austere log structure on a small hill overlooking the town. Inside, 5 elderly men sat around a long, plain wooden table. These were the deacons. They were the architects of Black Creek's rigid social order. their faces stern and utterly unforgiving. At the head of the table sat Silas Thorne, a man whose surname Elias immediately recognized as Jacob's, a connection that explained Jacob's profound guilt and fear. Silas's eyes were cold, sharp, and assessing. "You called for this meeting, Mr. Vance," Silas began, his voice dry and authoritative. "You speak of things you do not understand, and you have agitated one of our own. I spoke the truth to Jacob Thorne, and he spoke the truth to me," Elias returned, standing straight, projecting confidence. "He told me about the autumn tithing, the ceremony, and Lila Mae Higgins's refusal to participate. He told me she didn't run away. She fought, and she vanished near the North Path quarry." Silas didn't deny the ritual. He merely adjusted his posture. "The tithing is a necessity of this valley. We are isolated. The winter is harsh. Our survival requires cohesion and commitment. Lila Mae was chosen to affirm that commitment, to show her dedication to the welfare of the community. By vanishing after a struggle," Elias challenged, the silence in the room pressing against his eardrums. "That sounds like a forced sacrifice, Deacon Thorne, not a commitment." Another deacon, a gaunt man named Old Man Hemlock, leaned forward. "A choice was made, Mr. Vance. Her choice to defy the tradition was a choice against the community. That choice has consequences. The community must be protected from those who would shatter our necessary order." Protected. Jacob said he ran after he heard her screams near the North Path. What exactly is this tithing? What happens to the person dedicated? Silas Thorne stared at him, his gaze like ice. "The dedicated are given over to the mountain. A final, isolated pilgrimage to ensure the community's good fortune. It is a lonely burden, but a necessary one." "And the North Path quarry pit is the site of this pilgrimage?" Elias asked, careful with his phrasing. Silas gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It is the gateway, but you will not find Lila Mae there, journalist. You will only find a warning." "A warning of what?" "Of what happens to those who choose the self over the many, of what happens to those who disrupt the order." The air in the room grew heavy. Elias realized he hadn't just been given information. He had been given permission to search, knowing he would be walking into a trap, or at least a powerful deterrent. They weren't hiding the ritual anymore. They were showcasing its power. They were confident that no outsider could break their cultural grip or survive the physical realities of the mountain. "I will find Lila Mae," Elias said, his voice firm, refusing to break eye contact with Silas Thorne. Silas simply smiled, a thin, chilling expression. "We shall see, Mr. Vance. The mountain keeps its own council, and Black Creek keeps its own." Elias left the meeting house with a clear objective and a profound sense of isolation. The deacons hadn't tried to stop him. They had simply stated the terms of the valley's grim reality. He was now on a terrifying scavenger hunt, a journalist searching for a body or a dark truth, with the entire town watching his every move. Elias returned to the shed, his mind racing. The deacons were playing a terrifying game of psychological warfare. They were admitting the existence of the tithing and the location, the North Path quarry pit, not out of honesty, but out of supreme confidence that the mountain, the community, or both would defeat him. He secured the necessary supplies, a thick rope, a few dry biscuits, and his trusty carbide lamp. The rain had ceased, leaving the air clear but heavy with the scent of damp soil and ancient forest. The North Path was a narrow, treacherous animal trail, weaving through dense thickets of rhododendron and tangled brush. It was a path built for concealment, not travel. After an hour of difficult climbing, the trees abruptly gave way to a sheer, rocky drop. He had found the quarry. The pit was a deep, desolate scar on the mountainside. It was decades old, the jagged grey rock faces plummeting 50 feet to a murky, water-filled bottom. The air here was noticeably colder, the silence absolute. Elias cautiously approached the edge, swinging his carbide lamp across the rough terrain. He was looking for signs of a struggle, disturbed earth, or a recent burial. He spotted it near a thick cluster of ferns, a deep scuff mark, consistent with a boot heel dragging across the gravel. And next to it, partially hidden by a stone, was a small, unmistakable object, a silver locket. Elias knelt, heart pounding, and retrieved the locket. It was tarnished but heavy. He flipped it open. Inside were two small, faded photographs, one of Lila May smiling shyly, the other a blurry image of Jacob Thorne. The locket had been violently torn from her neck. Lila May Higgins had been here, and she had fought. But where was she now? Elias scanned the perimeter of the pit. He noticed something unusual near a jutting overhang of rock. 3 stones stacked vertically, a deliberately constructed marker. He moved toward it, his boots crunching loudly on the loose shale. Behind the stone marker, the earth looked freshly disturbed. Not deeply, but enough to suggest a hasty concealment. Elias produced his digging trowel and began to work, his movements desperate and frantic. After only a few minutes, the trowel struck something soft. He cleared the dirt away rapidly, revealing not a body, but a piece of rough-spun fabric, the sleeve of a woman's dress, a deep indigo color. He pulled at the fabric, revealing a small, shallowly buried cache. It contained several items: Lila May's wedding shawl, a pair of her worn leather boots, and a small, leather-bound book, a journal. The display was designed to be found, a theatrical confirmation of her fate. Elias quickly opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, the ink faded. The entries chronicled her happy life, her engagement to Jacob, and then a sudden, terrifying shift in tone 6 weeks ago. The deacons have been watching me. They say I have the spirit of the forest, whatever that means. Jacob is silent. He just watches me with that empty look. I asked him what was wrong. He said they're talking about the necessity again. The tithing. I never thought they would choose me. I never thought the things the old women whisper were true. The entry continued, describing the fear and confusion as the town's attention focused on her. They are preparing me, but not for the wedding. They bring me special teas, strange garments. They make me walk to the meeting house every night for instruction. It is not religious instruction, Jacob says. It's conditioning, to accept the role. He tried to tell me to run, but they are everywhere. The final entry, dated 3 weeks prior, was scribbled hastily, almost illegible. They are coming for me tonight. Jacob tried to stop them. He broke the engagement to save me, but it only made them angrier. I am at the quarry. They are waiting near the old iron grate. I will not go willingly. I will fight. If you find this journalist, tell the world what Black Creek does to its children. Elias looked up from the journal, his eyes scanning the pit. The old iron grate. He hadn't noticed it before. Hidden beneath the dense foliage on the far side of the pit, there was a small horizontal shaft, sealed by a heavy, rusted iron grate. This wasn't a grave. It was a concealed entrance. Lila May hadn't been buried here. She had been taken into the mine. The shallow grave was a ruse, a macabre message left by the deacons to confirm her death and end the inquiry. But Lila May's desperate journal entry provided the key to her real fate. They had forced her into the deep, abandoned tunnels. Elias clipped the journal to his belt. The mountain was not just a symbol of the town's isolation. It was their prison. He now had to find a way to open the grate and descend into the terrifying network of the abandoned mine, where the town's necessary ritual was either completed or still being carried out. The air suddenly felt thinner, colder. The true horror of Black Creek was about to begin. The iron grate was formidable. It was a heavy, rusted barrier, sealed with a thick iron bar held in place by a massive weathered padlock. The lock was clearly antique, a masterwork of pre-Civil War engineering, virtually impervious to simple tools. Elias cursed his lack of foresight. He couldn't go back to the town without raising suspicion, and he certainly couldn't ask the deacons for the key. He knelt, examining the lock, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow despite the chill. The air seeping from the shaft smelled of sulfur, damp rock, and something else. Something organic and unsettling. He remembered a small, sturdy rock hammer he had seen in Mrs. Dobbs's shed, used for splitting kindling. The memory was a sudden burst of hope. The lock was too thick to break, but the iron bar securing it was held in place by two heavy bolts driven into the rock on either side of the shaft. He might be able to widen the stone around the bolts. Elias ran back down the treacherous path, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to find Lila May alive. He managed to steal the hammer from the shed unnoticed, hiding it beneath his coat. The trip back was grueling, the physical exertion barely masking the mental terror. Back at the quarry, Elias worked methodically. The rock was slate, brittle in places but tough in others. Using the small hammer and a pointed shard of shale as a chisel, he began to chip away at the rock surrounding the bolt heads. Hours passed. The sun began to arc westward. He worked until his hands were blistered and his arms ached, his only motivation the terrifying contents of Lila May's journal. Finally, with a grating screech, one of the bolt heads came loose. He pried it free and focused on the second. When the second bolt finally tore loose from the rock with a dull, echoing thud, the heavy iron bar clattered to the ground. The way was open. Elias ignited his carbide lamp, the bright, focused beam cutting a cone of light into the darkness. The mine shaft was narrow, forcing him to crouch. He tied his rope securely around the strongest-looking tree root near the entrance and began his descent. The air inside was thick and suffocating. The narrow passage quickly opened into the main tunnel, a cavernous space where coal had once been excavated. Water dripped constantly, amplifying the silence. The beam of his lamp danced over the jagged walls, revealing decades of mineral staining and supporting timbers that looked dangerously rotten. Elias followed the tunnel, his breath ragged in the thick air. He had no plan, only the desperate hope that Lila May had been contained, not killed. He was relying on the cruel logic of the deacons. If the ritual was about dedication and necessary order, they might have kept her alive as a prisoner or a potent symbol. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel branched. He stopped, listening intently. Nothing but the dripping water. He consulted his journal, recalling a detail. Jacob had mentioned the sound coming from the north path, but also spoke of the area near the mine's deepest level. Elias chose the path that led downward, navigating over slick, uneven ties and loose rock. The descent was steep, the temperature dropping with every step. Suddenly, his lamp beam caught something ahead, near a particularly thick cluster of supporting timbers. Not a body, but a piece of clothing, identical to the indigo fabric in the bundle he found outside. A scrap of Lila May's dress, clearly snagged and torn. He was on the right track. He pressed on, the silence now punctuated by a subtle rhythmic sound, a low mechanical thump. 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 It was faint, but unmistakable. Not natural, not water. It sounded like machinery, perhaps an old manually operated pump or a windlass. He followed the sound for several minutes, the tunnel twisting sharply around a large, subterranean pillar of rock. When he rounded the corner, the sight before him stopped him dead. The tunnel opened into a large, dry cavern. The far wall was dominated by a huge, sealed wooden door, reinforced with iron. In front of the door was a makeshift camp, 2 lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, several crude pallets, and a stack of supplies. And standing guard, his back to Elias, was a large, broad-shouldered man, the barkeep from the clearing. He was methodically pumping water out of a low sump with a hand pump, the source of the rhythmic thump-thump. Elias quickly extinguished his carbide lamp and retreated into the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. The deacons had sealed Lila May into this inner chamber, and they had posted a guard. The pilgrimage was a lie. This was a prison. He was deep inside the mountain, within yards of the truth, but directly facing the physical obstacle of the town's silent enforcer. He knew he couldn't fight the massive barkeep. He had to observe, wait, and find another way into the chamber to discover what the autumn tithing truly required of its victim. Elias pressed himself against the cold, damp rock, his lungs aching for air. He could hear the persistent, grating rhythm of the hand pump and the guard's occasional grunt. He was dangerously close enough to smell the stale pipe smoke wafting from the barkeep. His mind raced, analyzing the guard's routine. The man, clearly the enforcer for the deacons, operated with meticulous, almost military precision. He pumped for 10 minutes, then sat on a stool for 15, staring blankly at the iron-reinforced door. He ate a small, monotonous meal of dried meat and hard bread. He was disciplined and therefore predictable. Elias had to find an angle, a weakness. He noticed that the guard kept the lanterns low, conserving oil, plunging the edges of the cavern into deep shadow. When the man stood to stretch, he would always walk a perimeter around the wooden door, seemingly checking for structural integrity. It was during one of these checks that Elias saw it. Near the top corner of the massive door, where the wood met the rock face, there was a small, square indentation. It looked like a vent, a small opening perhaps a foot wide, sealed with a wooden plug. It was likely the only source of air for the chamber inside. Elias waited for the barkeep to complete his circuit and returned to his stool. The moment the man settled, his back mostly to the shadow where Elias lay, Elias moved. He used the absolute silence of the mine and his own journalistic stealth, crawling on his belly over the uneven rock. The small sounds he made were swallowed by the consistent thump of the pump. He reached a point directly behind the barkeep's camp, hidden by a large, leaning timber. Elias pulled out a small, rolled-up sheet of paper, a spare page from his notebook. He knew he couldn't get close enough to speak or listen at the vent. He had to send a message. He meticulously scribbled 3 words onto the paper. "Lila, I'm here." He needed a distraction. The barkeep, though vigilant, was clearly bored. Elias noticed a pile of loose, softball-sized rocks near the base of the cavern wall, remnants of the mining operation. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he selected one and hurled it with all his might down the main tunnel, the path he had just taken. The rock skipped off the water-slicked tracks with a loud, metallic clang. The barkeep instantly stopped pumping. The sudden silence was jarring. He snatched a heavy mining pickaxe resting nearby and spun around, staring into the darkness of the main tunnel, away from Elias. "Who's there?" the man roared, his voice echoing menacingly. "Show yourself, damn you!" He stalked a few steps into the tunnel, his shadow stretching out behind him, his attention completely diverted. In that brief window, Elias darted forward, his heart hammering. He reached the door. The wooden plug covering the air vent was simple, secured only by a basic wooden latch. He managed to pry it open with the blade of his pocket knife, a nearly inaudible snap lost in the guard's continuing shouts. He quickly rolled the note tightly, pushed it through the square opening, and then, just as quickly, secured the wooden plug back into place. He flattened himself against the cold stone just as the barkeep returned, muttering curses under his breath, convinced the noise was just a rock slide or a loose timber. The guard sat back down, his breathing heavy, his eyes narrowed suspiciously at the dark tunnel. The rhythmic thump resumed. Elias waited for 5 agonizing minutes in the darkness, praying the note had been seen. He needed a confirmation, a sign that Lila May was alive and had received his message. Suddenly, a faint metallic scratching sound came from inside the chamber. It was subtle, easily masked by the pump, but Elias was attuned to every noise. It stopped. Then, a second later, the scratching resumed, this time closer to the vent. It was not random. It was a pattern. 3 distinct scratches. Then, silence. 3 scratches. Lila May had understood. A wave of profound relief and renewed terror washed over Elias. She was alive, but she was locked in a reinforced vault, guarded by a brutal enforcer. The scratch meant she had to be in a position to move, not incapacitated or dead. Elias knew he couldn't wait around. The guard would eventually inspect the door more closely or simply check the vent for air quality. He had to leave before he was discovered. He retreated with the same stealth he had arrived with, leaving the barking guard to his monotonous duty. He knew one thing now. He wasn't just investigating a disappearance, he was planning a rescue. He had to figure out how to breach that massive, locked door, and the only possible way was through Jacob Thorne, the man who had the key to the town's secrets, and possibly the only other man with a reason to want Lila May free. Elias returned to Black Creek under the cover of a thick, rolling mountain fog, the kind that swallows sound and muffles light. He made his way directly to Jacob Thorne's cabin near the mine entrance, bypassing the town center entirely. He hammered urgently on the door. "Jacob, open up! I know the truth. She's alive. She's in the deep tunnel." The door cracked open slightly. Jacob's face, already pale, was drawn and haggard, his eyes shadowed with sleepless worry. "Go away, Mr. Vance. I told you everything I know. If they see you here, they'll know I talked." "They already know you talked," Elias hissed, pushing the door open just enough to wedge himself inside. "The deacons showed me the fake grave, Jacob. They used your cancelled engagement to build their narrative. But Lila May left a note. She said they were taking her to the old iron grate. I found the tunnels. I found their guard. She's locked in a sealed chamber." Elias pulled out the locket he'd found. "She fought for this. She wants out. And you're the only person who can help me." Jacob stared at the locket, his body shaking. He finally collapsed onto a rough wooden chair, burying his face in his hands. "It's too late. It's all done. I tried to stop it, Mr. Vance, but the deacons, they are the law here." "No, they are criminals," Elias corrected sharply. "Tell me what the autumn tithing actually is. I know it's not just a religious dedication. What do they want with Lila May?" Jacob looked up, his eyes bloodshot with despair. "They want her endurance. They want her will. The teething is a test. They seal the chosen one in the deep chamber, often for days. They give her food, but they play with her mind. They tell her the outside world has forgotten her, that the community needs her death for their crops, their cattle, their survival. They break their spirit, Mr. Vance. They condition them to accept sacrifice. But why? Why this elaborate psychological torture? Because if she accepts her fate, they take her to the highest peak and leave her to die of exposure, a gift to the mountain. But if she breaks and begs for release, they let her out. They keep her alive, but utterly broken. She becomes a living testament to the deacon's power, a mindless servant, never to question the necessity again. Either way, the community sees the sacrifice, and the order is maintained." Elias felt a wave of nausea. The horror was entirely human, utterly depraved, and completely in line with the deacon's cold, calculated authority. "They're waiting for her to break. I sent her a note. She knows I'm here. That means the clock is ticking. They'll redouble their efforts to break her spirit before I can get back in. How do I open that door?" Jacob hesitated. "It's the original main storage vault. It has 2 bolts and a simple yet heavy mechanism. It requires 2 keys, held by the 2 most senior deacons, Silas Thorne and the preacher. The preacher, I haven't seen any church. He doesn't preach religion, he preaches the tithing. He's the one who performs the conditioning. Preacher Hemlock. Old man Hemlock, the gaunt deacon. Elias had his targets. Silas Thorne is Jacob's father, correct? That's why you're so terrified. Where would they keep the keys?" Silas keeps his on a chain around his neck. Hemlock. He keeps his in a lockbox hidden under the floorboards of the meeting house altar. Elias stood up, the plan forming rapidly. You need to help me, Jacob. I need to get into the meeting house tonight to get Hemlock's key, and I need a way to neutralize your father long enough to take his. Jacob looked at his hands, trembling with fear and inner conflict. The thought of betraying his father and the entire community was a terrible weight. I have to do this, Jacob. For Lila. For the chance to break this evil cycle. If she dies or if she breaks, the next victim is already chosen. The truth dies here. Jacob finally looked up, a fierce, desperate resolve hardening his face. I'll do it. I'll get you into the meeting house, and I'll find a way to get my father's key. But if we fail, there's nowhere in these mountains we can run. Then we won't fail, Elias vowed. The hunt for the keys begins now. Jacob has made his choice, and the danger has never been greater. Will they manage to unlock the chamber before Lila May's spirit is broken? Don't miss the next chapter of this terrifying story. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the real horror of the Appalachians, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment to tell us what part of the mystery you find the most chilling. The fog had intensified, a blessing that muffled their movements and obscured the moonlight. Jacob Thorne led Elias through the back alleys of Black Creek, navigating the greasy, mud-caked paths behind the shacks. Jacob was silent, moving with a desperate, familiar urgency. They reached the meeting house, a dark, imposing silhouette on the hill. The side window, Jacob whispered, pointing to a small, unlatched casement near the back. It's never locked. They believe their order is its own lock. Elias nodded, appreciating the chilling hubris of the deacons. He boosted Jacob up. The young man slipped inside with the practiced ease of someone who knew the building intimately. A moment later, a faint click echoed. The back door swung open. Elias slipped inside. The air was cold, stale, and smelled of old wood and candle wax. The sanctuary was simple: benches, a wooden lectern, and a raised platform with an unadorned altar. Jacob pointed to the altar. Preacher Hemlock's lockbox is under the floorboard directly in front of that. Working quickly and silently, they located the correct board. Jacob produced a small, flat-bladed tool, a carpenter's chisel from his coat. He gently inserted it into the gap and began to pry. The wood groaned under the pressure, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. Elias stood guard, his eyes glued to the windows. Finally, the board gave way, revealing a shallow recess beneath. Inside was a small, heavy wooden box, bound with leather straps. The box was sealed with a small latch, easily opened with Elias's knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry hay, lay a single heavy iron key. It was old, hand-forged, and utterly unique. Preacher Hemlock's key. One down, Elias whispered, securing the key inside his coat. Now for Silas. Where is he at this hour? He's at home preparing, Jacob replied, his voice strained. Tonight is the night of the final conditioning. They hold a vigil while the victim makes her choice. He won't leave the house. He keeps the key on a chain even while he sleeps. We can't confront him directly. He's too strong and he'll raise the alarm. Jacob's face tightened with internal struggle. There's a window in his bedroom. It's often left ajar because of his bad cough. And there is a small bottle on his nightstand. It's a tincture he takes for his restlessness. It's mostly medicinal whiskey, but he's prone to overdosing if it's heavily diluted with something stronger. Laudanum, Elias suggested, his tone flat. Jacob nodded, his face pale with the implications. A small measure of crushed poppy seeds, often used for minor aches. I know where the family keeps the supply. Elias looked at him with an expression of cold calculation. We are not here to kill him, Jacob. We are here to neutralize him long enough to get the key. We mix a dose that will put him into a deep, heavy sleep. No more. You understand? This must be about rescue, not revenge. "I understand," Jacob mumbled, the horror of what he was doing warring with his love for Lila May. They moved with the oppressive fog as their shroud, heading for Silas Thorne's house, a larger, slightly more dignified structure than the others. Jacob led Elias around the back to a small kitchen window. Inside he found the jar of dried poppy seeds. He quickly crushed a generous portion in a mortar and pestle, mixing it with a small amount of warm water in a vial. Then they moved to the side of the house where Silas's bedroom was located. The window was indeed open a crack. Jacob, heart pounding, slipped his arm through and carefully located the small vial of medicine on the nightstand. With trembling hands, he uncorked the vial and poured the crushed poppy seed mixture into the dark liquid, stirring it silently with a twig. They retreated into the shadows. Now, they could only wait for Silas to take his nightly dose. The wait was unbearable, measured only by the distant slow chime of the old town clock. Finally, after nearly an hour, a faint cough rattled from the room. A soft, scraping sound followed, indicating Silas had moved. Then the almost imperceptible glug of liquid being swallowed. They waited another agonizing 20 minutes. Elias, unable to wait longer, used a long, slender tree branch to gently tap on the windowsill. Silence. He tapped again, louder. Still silence. "Now," Elias breathed. Jacob, eyes wide with fear, used his knife to pop the window open entirely. Elias boosted him up. Jacob disappeared inside, moving like a ghost. Elias heard a faint metallic clink. A second later, Jacob's head reappeared in the window. He dropped a thick silver chain, its key glinting dully, into Elias's outstretched hand. Silas Thorne's key. Elias secured the second key. The silence of the night was the only witness. They had the means to open the vault. "We go now," Elias whispered, pulling Jacob from the window. "To the quarry. This ends tonight." The return journey to the quarry pit was a desperate, almost silent blur. Elias and Jacob moved with a focused urgency, the heavy keys swinging against Elias's ribs. The fog was beginning to lift, a cruel sign that dawn was not far off, and with it, the possible conclusion of the tithing. They descended into the mine shaft. The air inside was still cold and heavy, but the faint, rhythmic thump of the hand pump was louder now. The guard, the enforcer, was still on duty. He's never left that post for more than 20 minutes at a time in the last 6 hours. Jacob whispered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to draw him away, but it has to be a genuine distraction, something that requires him to use the pickaxe or leave the cavern completely." Elias considered the cavern. The support timbers were old, and the ground was slick with moisture. "He keeps the carbide lamp focused on the door and the pump," Elias observed. "The path behind him, the main tunnel, is dark. If we can trigger a minor collapse, just enough to block the path or simulate a dangerous structural failure, he'll be forced to investigate." "How?" Elias pointed to a stack of debris, old, rotten timbers and rock fragments, piled near a major structural pillar about 15 feet from the guard. "When he stops pumping, we use the time to stack those timbers against that pillar. We use the rock hammer to chip away at the support base, making it look unstable. Then, when he's focused on the pump again, we hit the stack with a large rock. The sound of a collapse will draw him away." It was a dangerous, desperate plan. They had to assume the timber was rotten enough to give way convincingly. They waited for the guard's scheduled break. When the thump finally ceased, they moved quickly. They stacked the debris, Jacob working with frantic efficiency. They then used the rock hammer to simulate damage at the base of the main pillar, a constant scratching sound barely audible over their rapid breathing. When the guard started pumping again, Elias found the largest piece of loose rock he could manage. He waited for the man to hit a particularly loud, strong stroke on the pump, a moment of maximum noise, and hurled the rock at the stacked timbers. Crack, thud! The sound was explosive, followed by the terrifying, echoing sound of falling wood and rock. The pump stopped dead. "Cave in!" the guard roared, grabbing his pickaxe. "The main support! That's the one! The whole level's going!" He ran past them, completely fixated on the sight and sound of the simulated structural failure, plunging into the dark main tunnel to assess the damage. Elias and Jacob sprinted to the sealed wooden door. Elias inserted Silas Thorne's key into the top lock. Jacob inserted Hemlock's into the bottom. Both keys turned with a rusty, grating crunch, the sound agonizingly loud. With a final desperate heave, Elias pushed the two heavy bolts free. The massive wooden door was secured only by its own weight. They pushed. The wood groaned, the iron hinges shrieked, and the door swung inward with a blast of stale air. Inside, the chamber was a small, dry space, barely lit by a single guttering oil lamp on a makeshift table. And there she was, Lila Mae Higgins. She was sitting on a cot, wearing the rough, indigo dress, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She looked pale, exhausted, but her eyes were wide, focused, and utterly lucid. She hadn't broken. She had survived the conditioning. "Jacob," she whispered, a sound filled with both relief and exhaustion. "I knew you wouldn't let them win. Lila, we're getting you out." Jacob rushed to her, embracing her fiercely. Elias, the journalist, stood guard, his eyes scanning the chamber. On the table he saw the tools of the deacon's psychological warfare, a stack of sermons written in Hemlock's spidery script, detailing the necessity of her sacrifice, a small vial of clear, unappetizing water, and an empty plate. "We have to move," Elias urged. "The guard will be back." Suddenly a loud, panicked shout echoed from the main tunnel. "It's a trap. The timbers are fine. It's a trick." The guard was returning. "Lila, can you walk?" Elias asked, grabbing her arm. "Yes." "They made me walk. To keep my strength up. For the final pilgrimage." They moved, Jacob supporting her, Elias leading the way, running back toward the entrance shaft. But as they reached the main tunnel, the barking guard burst around the corner, his eyes wild, his pickaxe raised high. He saw them, Lila Mae, Jacob, and the journalist, and let out a furious, animalistic roar. "You fools! You have doomed us all! The ritual must be completed!" The enforcer lunged. The cavern exploded into chaos. The guard, a man whose strength was built on a lifetime of manual labor, swung the pickaxe in a wide, desperate arc. "Jacob! Lila! Run!" Elias shouted, shoving them toward the entrance shaft. Elias, knowing he couldn't outfight the man, acted purely on instinct. He ducked under the wild swing, the pickaxe blade narrowly missing his head and burying itself with a jarring crunch into the wooden table where the conditioning materials lay. The guard tried to wrench the axe free, momentarily stuck. Elias seized the opportunity. He grabbed the heavy, empty coal scuttle nearby and swung it like a club, smashing it into the side of the guard's head. The man staggered, roaring in pain and fury, but didn't fall. He pulled the pickaxe free, his face a mask of primal violence. "You shouldn't have interfered, city man. Now you'll pay the tithing." Elias backed away, desperately searching the ground. He spotted the heavy, antique padlock he had taken off the grate earlier. As the guard charged, Elias slipped on the slick ground, but in the fall he managed to grab the padlock. The guard raised the pickaxe for the final blow. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Elias threw the heavy padlock with all his strength. It struck the guard squarely in the temple. The massive man cried out, his legs buckling. The pickaxe dropped harmlessly to the ground, and he crumpled onto the cold, damp stone, unconscious. Elias didn't wait to check on him. He scrambled toward the entrance shaft where Jacob and Lila Mae were waiting, Jacob already pulling himself up the rope. "Hurry! He won't be out for long!" Elias yelled. Lila Mae, though weak, ascended the rope with a fierce determination born of survival. Jacob followed, his arms burning with the effort. Elias secured the rope and began his own agonizing climb, the adrenaline already beginning to fade, leaving his body heavy and aching. They finally emerged from the mouth of the mine into the pre-dawn air. The fog was gone. The sky was turning a sickly gray. "We have to get out of the valley," Elias gasped, pulling Lila May forward. "The deacons will be awake soon. Silas will realize the key is gone." They scrambled down the treacherous slope, their feet slipping on the wet path. As they reached the edge of the woods overlooking Black Creek, the town below was beginning to stir. They could see movement, men hurrying toward the meeting house, an obvious sign that Silas Thorne had discovered the theft. "The old logging road." Jacob pointed desperately. "It goes high up the ridge. It's difficult, but it will take us out of the valley, away from the main road." They plunged into the trees, pushing through the thick, wet foliage. Below them, a single, high-pitched shout echoed through the valley. "They're gone! The keys are gone! The girl! Get the girl!" The hunt was on. They hiked for hours, Jacob driving them forward, his knowledge of the terrain their only asset. Lila May, despite her ordeal, walked with a growing strength, fueled by the sheer will to live. As the full sun finally crested the Appalachian peaks, they reached the ridge, a high, rocky outcrop that offered a final, horrifying view of Black Creek below. They could see men scattering from the town center, organizing into small search parties, beginning to ascend the various paths. But they had gained enough of a lead. They didn't stop to rest. They continued down the logging road, away from the valley. They walked until midday, finally reaching a small, remote settlement miles away, a community untouched by the chilling cult of the tithing. They found a sheriff, a man who listened with skepticism, but eventually with dawning horror, to Elias's meticulously detailed account, corroborated by Lila May's clear, if traumatic, testimony and the crucial evidence, Lila May's journal and the 2 heavy keys. The subsequent investigation, led by the regional sheriff and backed by Elias's detailed journalistic evidence, was a slow, agonizing process. Black Creek was a fortress of silence. But the keys, the journal, and the discovery of the unconscious guard in the mine were undeniable. Silas Thorne, Preacher Hemlock, and the other deacons were arrested. They never confessed, maintaining until the end that they were performing a necessary ritual for the survival of their people. They believed their isolation and their terrible custom granted them immunity. But Elias Vance's articles, published across the state and eventually the nation, exposed the chilling psychological torture of the autumn tithing, detailing the town's collective delusion and the cruelty of the human-made horror. The community of Black Creek, stripped of its self-proclaimed order and its dark secret, fractured and dissolved under the harsh light of external justice. Lila May and Jacob Thorne were married quietly, choosing to build a life far from the shadow of the mountains, forever marked by the terror of the valley, but unbroken by it. Elias Vance, the journalist, had not just found a story. He had destroyed an entire system of terror, confirming that the most terrifying evils are not those that come from the supernatural, but those that are born and bred in the absolute isolation and depravity of the human heart.